Every day, it seems, we wake up to constitutional crisis after crisis. The news cycle is unrelenting with changes in government driven by the Trump administration's bid to concentrate power in the executive branch. It almost seems quaint now that just a few months ago, congressmen were voicing outrage over a prayer said by the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson.
And then I was asked to provide a prayer for the nation. I offered one that is quite familiar to historians and probably many of us. It said right here in the program, it says right under my name, "It is said each day of his 8 years of the presidency and every day thereafter until his death, President Thomas Jefferson recited this prayer." I wanted to share it with you here at the end of my remarks, not as a prayer per se right now, but as a reminder of what our third president and the primary author of the Declaration of Independence thought was so important that it should be a daily recitation. Let me just read you that prayer. It goes like this. Thomas Jefferson's Prayer for the Nation, it's entitled. Almighty God.
I mean, the moment that Johnson was setting up the prayer and saying that it was something that Thomas Jefferson had prayed every single day, I don't know, the alarm bells went off, and I thought, I know Thomas Jefferson well enough, not as well as you, but I was like, I know Jefferson well enough. I mean, I literally grew up in Jefferson City, Missouri, went to Thomas Jefferson Middle School. So, we've done a lot of like Thomas Jefferson stuff, through the years, right? And I know enough about his faith that I was like, that doesn't sound right. So like, I'm actually Googling while Johnson is still like introducing the prayer, before he's even like started reading the prayer. I'm Googling it and I find Monticello's page about this as a spurious quotation, because some people go further and say Jefferson even wrote the prayer, not just that he said it daily. So then I'm reading on the screen the prayer as Johnson is reading it live, knowing that this is, falsely attributed. I mean, that's how obvious it was to me, that I just knew the moment he started introducing it, and I found that it was fake before he even started reading it.
That was Brian Kaylor, editor of the venerable independent publication Word and Way. When Speaker of the House Mike Johnson started talking about Thomas Jefferson, he immediately thought, he's going to say something wrong. And as it turned out, he was right. So what did Johnson say? Find out in today's episode of Mike Johnson's False Jefferson Prayer. The rest of the story. Hi, I'm Warren Throckmorton, and I'm the host of the podcast Telling Jefferson Lies. Today is the first segment of the second season. Yesterday was Thomas Jefferson's birthday. He was born on April 13th, 282 years ago in 1743. I'm focusing on Jefferson today because his birthday's this month and because of the relatively recent story invoking him and a prayer falsely attributed to him. But I also want to make it clear that most of the remaining segments will not be about Jefferson in a direct way. However, I will refer to a Jefferson lie, but by that I mean something false which is told to promote the idea that America was intentionally founded as a Christian nation. There are lies, and then there are Jefferson lies. There are lies about history which are told to shape a narrative and create a myth which hides the truth. The goal of this podcast is to expose and debunk that kind of falsehood. Today I also want to officially announce the release of the third edition of Getting Jefferson Right, fact-checking claims about Thomas Jefferson. Michael Coulter and I wrote this book to debunk false claims about Jefferson, literal Jefferson lies. The first season had several segments where our work in that book was highlighted, and now we have updated that book again. In this edition, material from today's story about Speaker of the House Mike Johnson is included. I'm also happy to say that within the past several days, a copy of the third edition was mailed to every member of Congress. It's perhaps a small raft in a large sea of turmoil going on right now, but we wanted to advocate for the separation of church and state in a nation where that principle seems to be getting lost. Consider this today's commercial. You can get the book at Amazon or order it from your favorite bookstore. Okay, now back to the story of the fake Jefferson prayer. On January 3rd, 2025, Louisiana Representative Mike Johnson was re-elected to be Speaker of the House of Representatives. After his re-election, he gave remarks to the full House, and as a part of his speech, he offered comments on a prayer he said Thomas Jefferson said every day. Listen.
And this morning, I participated with many of you early this morning in the 119th Congress Interfaith Prayer Service. It was held at St. Peter's Catholic Church. Many of you were there. It was an ecumenical service in a bipartisan service, which was great. My good friend Hakeem Jeffries began by a reading with the Old Testament. He read out of Deuteronomy 10. And then I was asked to provide a prayer for the nation. I offered one that is quite familiar to historians and probably many of us. It's said right here in the program, it says right under my name, it is said each day of his 8 years of the presidency and every day thereafter until his death, President Thomas Jefferson recited this prayer. I wanted to share it with you here at the end of my remarks, not as a prayer per se right now, but as a reminder of what our third president and the primary author of the Declaration of Independence thought was so important that it should be a daily recitation. Let me just read you that prayer. It goes like this. Thomas Jefferson's Prayer for the Nation, it's entitled. Almighty God, who has given us this good land for our heritage, we humbly beseech thee that we may always prove ourselves a people mindful of thy favor and glad to do thy will. Bless our land with honorable ministry, sound learning, and pure manners. Save us from violence, discord, and confusion, from pride and arrogance, and from every evil way. Defend our liberties and fashion into one united people the multitude brought hither out of many kindreds and tongues. Endow with thy spirit of wisdom those whom in thy name we entrust the authority of government, that there may be justice and peace at home, and that through obedience to thy law we may show forth thy praise among the nations of the earth. In time of prosperity, fill our hearts with thankfulness, and in the day of trouble, suffer not our trust in thee to fail, of which we ask through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. That was Thomas Jefferson's prayer. Suffer not our trust in thee to fail. We will not fail. We cannot fail. We are all in this together. Our nation is counting on us to band together and solve these problems and get this done.
When I first heard that, like Brian Kaylor, I knew that prayer didn't sound like Jefferson.
Yeah, I really went down a number of rabbit holes on chasing this one. And part of it was, I wrote a real quick piece, here's what Johnson claimed, and it's not true. Like, Jefferson didn't say this prayer, is written decades after his death, and here's the proof we already know. It's already been debunked in the past. And then I'm pretty sure I was the first news article out about that, debunking it, there on that Friday that he did it. And then I started seeing a bunch of comments online of people saying, he got it from David Barton, which is a great guess. I mean, David Barton, as you and I both know, is horrible at Jefferson history, lots of lies, and Johnson, listens and trusts, unfortunately, what Barton has to say. But I did a quick look and realized that I couldn't see that Barton had ever made this claim. But I kept seeing this pop up. So then I'm like, okay, well, where did it come from? Because I also thought Johnson didn't make this up. And so I was curious, if he didn't get it from Barton, where did he get it?
Mike Johnson is one of those curious people who has legal training, but takes his historical cue from a self-taught amateur. Before he was elected speaker, he attended seminars put on by David Barton, the Christian Nation storyteller we featured last season. Barton is probably the person in the United States most responsible for the current Christian nationalist assault on separation of church and state. His books and talks are considered gospel by Christian nationalists. In 2021, Johnson said this about David Barton on one of Barton's radio shows.
I just want to say at the outset, I am so grateful to Wall Builders and David and Rick and everybody involved. And I was introduced to David and his ministry a quarter century ago, and it has had such a profound influence on me and my work and my life and everything I do. So I'm just so grateful you guys continue to sow into this work and help equip the soldiers on the front lines. And so thanks to all of you for being willing to serve.
He wasn't kidding. I think he really means it when he sees Barton as an expert. Johnson parrots Barton's teaching. On a CNBC television program, Johnson was asked what he thought about the separation of church and state. This is what he said.
And so they wanted faith to be a big part of that. The separation of church and state is a misnomer. People misunderstand it. Of course, it comes from a phrase that was in a letter that Jefferson wrote. It's not in the Constitution. And what he was explaining is they did not want the government to encroach upon the church. Not that they didn't want principles of faith to have influence on our public life. It was exactly the opposite.
What Johnson said is very similar to what Barton teaches. Religion can influence government, but not the other way around. And when he says religion, he means Christianity. In the minds of Christian nationalists, when they say religion, they mean Christianity. So when he quoted the prayer and said with conviction that Jefferson prayed it every day and really meant it, he might have thought it was true. As it turns out, this time he didn't get that prayer from Barton. I'd never heard Barton refer to that prayer or attribute it to Jefferson. However, Barton isn't the only Christian nationalist storyteller out there. Clearly, Barton is the Shohei Ohtani of yarn spinners. But there are other journeymen out there who can get the job done. In my searching, I found that prayer in a 1995 book of quotes by William Federer. Federer includes the prayer and cites Jefferson's second inaugural address as the source. Gentle listener, you can go read Jefferson's second inaugural address. That prayer is not in there. The reason is that Jefferson didn't write it or even say it. By the time the prayer was written, Jefferson was pretty dead. But there's a lot more to this story, so I'm going to back it up and let Brian Kaylor explain.
We do know, and we have some sources that identify this prayer, which Episcopal priest wrote it in the 1880s. And as you said, it was for inclusion into the Episcopal Church's Book of Common Prayer. It did not actually make it in that edition that was being created in the latter part of the 19th century, but there was kind of a campaign for some time thereafter that, hey, we should have this prayer that churches could bring up and offer as a prayer for the country. And that was just kind of the purpose of the prayer in the first place.
The priest's name was George Lyman Locke. He was the rector of St. Michael's Episcopal Church in Bristol, Rhode Island for 52 years. Locke wrote the prayer in 1882 and gave it to William Reed Huntington. Huntington was a member of the Book of Common Prayer Revision Committee and submitted the prayer for inclusion to the book in 1883. However, the prayer didn't make the cut until 1828. Again, Brian Kaylor.
As I was looking at references to Jefferson, I realized that there were some people that were actually attributing it to George Washington and saying that Washington had written it. So I chased that rabbit for a while and realized that's the older story. And it seems to just pop up in 1921, at least in the newspaper archives. I'm sure the story was probably circulating a little bit before that, but there are multiple newspapers that year in Louisiana, interesting enough, the home state of Mike Johnson, is where the George Washington story first shows up in print around George Washington's birthday. And it was described as "For Our Country," which is the name of the Episcopal prayer by the Episcopal priest, but attributed to George Washington. And then that's the story, by the way, then for the next multiple decades. We'll get to the Jefferson part in a moment, but everyone's linking it to Washington or the actual author, the Episcopal priest, for decades before Jefferson's name is ever brought into it. And after those 3 newspapers in Louisiana in 21, the next year we see it all across the country. We see it has spread. And so that's how these things happen, right? And a couple of the newspapers at first identified a correspondent that had sent the prayer in. We don't know if he's the one that made the attribution or if he had heard it from somewhere else. But by the next year, people are just printing it. This is a prayer for our country by George Washington, and there is no sourcing given at all. And it just spreads like this for decades as the key source. It took me a while. I eventually came up with what I think is the best theory as to why the prayer gets attributed to Washington. So there was actually an Episcopal Church convention in St. Louis, Missouri in 1916. And there was an effort, actually. This is, again, they were debating a new version of the Book of Common Prayer. And there was an effort to get this Episcopal priest's prayer back in for the first time into the Book of Common Prayer. And there was actually a move to replace that recommendation with a prayer that is actually from George Washington. And this is, something we know he actually included in a letter. And so that was a big proposal. It sparked some headlines across the country because initially there was a group at the convention that approved it. And so there are headlines about how the Episcopal Church has adopted Washington's prayer. Now, ultimately, that proposal ended up dying in some later steps of the Episcopal Church's process. And so they went back with the original recommendation of using this Episcopal prayer from the late 1880s. But I wonder if someone saw all these headlines that, they're adopting Washington's prayer, then sees the text of the prayer for our country that was adopted and just made that mistake, not realizing that they had actually not adopted Washington's prayer. But then for the next 4 to 5 decades, that's the story we see every February, especially. Sometimes around 4th of July, and even a couple times at Christmas. It was called a holiday prayer for our country, which I find funny. This idea of, here's a prayer from the first president of the United States, and it was used to justify Christian nationalism, right? To say, see, if this is what George Washington wrote, we should be a Christian nation.
We will get to Jefferson shortly, but it's worth pointing out that in earlier days, George Washington was a much higher value target for Christian nationalists than Thomas Jefferson. From the time Jefferson was alive, he was well known as a skeptic or a Unitarian, or at least not someone who could be rehabilitated into an evangelical Christian. Washington, on the other hand, had been a Rorschach test ever since he was alive. He rarely spoke about his personal beliefs and almost never referred to Jesus. He avoided taking communion, even leaving church when it was offered. When he dedicated the Capitol building in 1793, he did so leading a Masonic ceremony with no prayers of dedication to Christ. However, his early biographers rehabilitated his Anglican church attendance into orthodoxy. Mason Weems wrote a very popular hagiography, which first was published in 1800. Hagiography is defined as a biography that idealizes its subject. Weems brought us the cherry tree story. You remember that? Washington chopped down his dad's cherry tree, and his dad was so pleased that Washington told him the truth. Except probably the story didn't happen. At least we have no way of knowing if it did. Weems also has Washington kneeling and praying in the snow at Valley Forge. This almost certainly did not happen. Washington was the subject of many efforts to make him into a born-again Christian. Jefferson, though, not so much. It has only been in more recent times that Christian nationalist storytellers have targeted Jefferson for religious reclamation. So how does this prayer go from a Washington lie into a Jefferson lie? Again, Brian Kaylor sleuthed out a pretty good theory.
Yes, and so this one took quite a while for me to finally track down what I think is ground zero for the Jefferson attribution. And it's kind of a 1-2 step. There's the person I think made the mistake, and then there's the person who popularized it, the kind of Johnny Appleseed of this story, who goes around and plants it in a bunch of newspapers for several years until it really gets stuck into the popular imagination. And it seems to be, again, a very innocent mistake about edits to the Episcopal Church's Book of Common Prayer. Someone just got confused. And so it's actually an Episcopal minister is the one who seems to have started the story that Jefferson was reading this prayer every single day. Reverend Hubert Donovan was actually pastor of an Episcopal church in Virginia, in Charlottesville, that Jefferson had given some funds to and had, some interaction with. So he's giving a talk, ironically enough, for the Monticello Foundation, which is the same group that I found on their website today, debunking any connection between Jefferson and the prayer. But ironically, the origin actually is at one of their events. And so he seems to be talking about how Jefferson did have a book, a common prayer. And, we know that he, would have flipped through it and read through it. And so then he instead picks up his book of common prayer and reads the prayer for our country. And I guess he didn't realize that the edition that he had was a newer volume that had some changes. And so even though the prayer for our country that was in his current Book of Common Prayer, that prayer was not actually in the one that he was holding that was older, that was Thomas Jefferson's personal copy of the Book of Common Prayer. Seems to be a very innocent mistake, but again, it's just a misconfusion about different editions of the same book of prayer. And so that's in 1956, and that seems to be it in the public record for a few years. But then in 1962, we have a trustee for the Monticello Foundation and a former Eisenhower ambassador to Switzerland, Henry Taylor, writes a column popularizing it. And I mean, and his column is a big push for we're a Christian nation, in God we trust, and our forefathers followed God. And his evidence is that Jefferson had this book of a book of common prayer, and in it there's this prayer for our country, and then he cites the whole prayer. That syndicated column goes in multiple newspapers that year. But then I found that it gets reprinted every single year, dozens of times for over a decade.
So Count Henry Taylor is an early baptizer and reviser of Jefferson. On April 13, 1962, Jefferson's birthday, hundreds of newspapers around the nation printed Taylor's tribute to Jefferson and included the prayer for the nation. Here's some of what Taylor wrote. Quote, Thomas Jefferson's birthday, April 13th, should be more widely celebrated by our grateful nation, and certainly the prayer Jefferson said for our country can be well repeated. I have been honored to read at his grave a prayer from Jefferson's own prayer book, a small brown volume, its pages yellowed with age and frayed in its use in the hands of the great leader. In seeking the solace that can come only from prayer, in meeting the dark trials on the desperate early years of our republic, in carrying burdens of the presidency for 8 long years and to the day of his death, Jefferson turned to this book and said this prayer for his country. And then Taylor quoted that prayer that Jefferson never prayed even one day of his life. It didn't take long for savvy readers to recognize a problem with Taylor's column. On April 21, 1962, in the Los Angeles Times, the Reverend John Gill, a chaplain of the Harvard School, located in North Hollywood, California, wrote a letter to the editor and provided the true source and authorship of the prayer. Things haven't changed much. Here we are in 2025, still trying to get the record straight. Here's what the Reverend Gill had to say in his letter to the editor. Quote, I read with interest Henry Taylor's column on the Thomas Jefferson's prayer in the Times, April 18th. The prayer itself expresses most beautifully the Christian's concern for his country and its welfare. I am, however, somewhat confused by Mr. Taylor's attributing this particular prayer to Jefferson's prayer book. According to Dr. Massey Shepard, the prayer was written by the Reverend George Lyman Locke and was first established in 1883 and did not appear in the American Prayer Book until 1928. The history of the writing of the prayer can be found on pages 35 and 36 of Dr. Shepard's study of the Book of Common Prayer. Who's correct, I wonder? The Reverend John Gill, chaplain, Harvard School, North Hollywood, end quote. There's a darker side to the history of this prayer's associations with Presidents Washington and Jefferson. Some pretty unsavory far right-wing characters have pushed the Christian nationalist themes in the prayer and taken advantage of the false attribution to both Washington and Jefferson.
It appears that another important figure was H.L. Hunt. So it gets fed into the kind of business community, the kind of Christian far-right business community.
That's Willamette University history professor Seth Cotlar, who was also writing about Mike Johnson's prayer on January 3rd. Cotlar teaches courses in early American history and more recent American fascist movements.
And so Hunt is this really important historical figure that I don't feel like people know enough about. He's a huge funder of Dan Smoot, the John Birch Society, these kind of organizations in the 60s. And H.L. Hunt also has a Lifeline publication and a radio show that's broadcast all over the country. He writes hundreds or thousands of op-eds to local newspapers. And H.L. Hunt is a kind of typical John Birch Society-esque right-wing reactionary who in the 1960s believes that the nation is beset by a communist conspiracy. And he thinks that those communists are out to destroy Christian America, as he sees it. So for Hunt, the idea that America was founded not just as a religiously pluralistic society in which freedom of religion was encouraged, but rather founded as a explicitly Christian nation is to him a really important plank in his worldview. H.L. Hunt notoriously wasn't super, how should I put it, scrupulous about the truth of things. And so, H.L. Hunt, who knows where he saw it, how it came across his transom, but, this was bait for him, right? I mean, this is part of this dynamic for right-wingers who find these apocryphal founders quotes, that it's just straight up confirmation bias, right? It's like, here's what I want to be true. Oh, look, here's this thing that fits with the way I view the world. How convenient. This is amazing. Have you seen this Jefferson prayer? It's fantastic. Everybody needs to see this. And H.L. Hunt just then used his access to the media and to print to just pump this thing into the nation's bloodstream.
Hunt believed Lyndon Johnson was controlled by minorities and the media was controlled by socialists. He set up alternative media so he could get his alternative reality out to the people. The prayer associated with Jefferson was a small part of that. As Cotlar points out, he had creative ways of doing so.
And then it gets picked up in all kinds of wild ways. Like it becomes a thing that funeral directors will use for their advertisements. Like dozens of these funeral, and every small town has their own funeral director. And I don't know how this happened, whether it's the Funeral Directors Advertising Association or someone who let these funeral directors know that if you need some copy for your ad, here it is.
Hunt wasn't the only far-right bigot who spread the false association of Jefferson to the prayer.
Yeah, so Gerald L.K. Smith, who was he was the founder of the America First Party and the founder of the Christian Nationalist Crusade in the 1940s, and was sort of America's most notorious anti-Semite for the entirety of the post-World War II era. But Gerald L.K. Smith was a hugely influential figure on the American right. He claimed to have had a mailing list of 3 million people, and his cross and the flag had a pretty significant circulation, like over 100,000, which was roughly the same as the circulation of the National Review. And Smith was one of these figures who, the National Review would never write about him. They would never talk about him. And they didn't. Bill Buckley reviled him. I mean, he thought he was just an anti-Semitic kook. But the thing is, Gerald L.K. Smith and the people who read him thought of themselves as conservative American Christian patriots. That's how they understood themselves. And so in that sense, that kind of Christian nationalist view of the country's history, Smith is an important kind of conduit for that.
Smith published the prayer with Jefferson as the author in his newsletter in 1970. Eventually, the prayer made it into some Catholic publications, and then into William Federer's Encyclopedia in 1995. In each case, the prayer served a purpose.
Yeah, regardless of whether it's a story about Washington or it's a story about Jefferson by Mike Johnson and others, the purpose of the prayer has by these individuals has always been the same: to create a justification for Christian nationalism and for establishing Christianity. It's always been the same purpose, whether they put Washington's name on it or Jefferson's name on it.
I agree. The broad purpose is to align religious authority with political authority. These myths are weapons of propaganda designed to remake history into a past that wasn't. Remember our theme from last season? Christian nationalism requires distorted history to get Christian nationalists things done. Christian nationalists differ among themselves about what needs to get done, but they all need great Christian stories about a great Christian nation with great Christian founders. Having said that, it doesn't follow that all Christian nationalists know what they're doing. Here again is Seth Cotlar.
I don't think that they're doing it knowing that it's fake. I think they're doing it because they're falling prey to confirmation bias. And rather than this being a moment where they might then ask themselves, why was I suckered into thinking this? And what does that show about the limitations of my knowledge about this thing that I profess to care about and which I use as a basis for the authority that I wield as a public figure? Rather than doing that, they just either ignore it or wave it away or, don't use it as a moment for kind of either personal reflection or national reflection about these really important questions, of the relationship between church and state and the role of religion in a pluralistic constitutional democracy.
Well, the last piece of the puzzle is, where did Johnson get the text of the prayer? Since he didn't get it from David Barton, I thought he might have gotten it from William Federer's Encyclopedia. We don't know for certain, since Johnson never replied to numerous requests to that very question. However, it appears he wasn't alone in his belief that the prayer was recited by Jefferson. Listen again to Brian Kaylor.
That's also what I found that was really significant is Johnson's direct source. So while, the story and trying to connect this prayer to Jefferson started in, the mid 50s and early 1960s, I was still wondering, well, how did it get into Johnson's speech? And so as I watched the moment again, I realized very clearly that the claim he makes about Jefferson reading this every day, he's reading from a program of a prayer service he had attended that morning. And I found the program. I actually found pictures of it on social media from a number of members of Congress posted it. And it was a prayer service organized by the House chaplain. And the House chaplain, Margaret Kibben, is a Presbyterian Church USA minister. So she is a mainline Protestant liberal denomination. And she's the one whose office created this program and printed it and included this claim. And I think that is really significant. So it turns out the source for Johnson was not David Barton. The source for him this time was a liberal mainline Protestant female minister. That shows you the extent that some of these myths are working throughout our nation, that it's not just, a problem that we have to whack-a-mole on the right. It's also popping up over here in places where we wouldn't necessarily believe it.
I asked Kaylor if he thought that was unusual.
Actually, I was familiar with this prayer before Johnson because I co-wrote Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Helped Build Christian Nationalism with Bo Underwood. And we actually have a whole section in the book about the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer as a leading mainline Protestant denomination. And we went through and note the Christian nationalism in the prayers. And so we actually have a reference and quote from this actual prayer in our book to say This is Christian nationalism, and it's essentially a call that even though the Episcopal Church today has a reputation as a very progressive and a group that we wouldn't expect to be Christian nationalist, they actually still have a lot of Christian nationalism from their history. They used to be a state church, and they haven't completely detoxed from that. And I would note, her office did not respond to my request for comment before publishing. I try not to take that personally, but she did give a comment to Jack Jenkins at Religion News Service, basically downplayed the fact that this is like completely false and absolutely not true, because she said the beginning of the statement was as it has been said. So that leaves room for it being true or false. Like, no, this is 100% false. Like, the prayer was written decades after Jefferson's death. We know he did not read it once, let alone every single day. And the fact that she's not even willing to come out and be like, whoops, this is wrong, make a public acknowledgement. Because what's happening now that Johnson stood in the chamber of the U.S. House of Representatives and repeated this claim, it has this new burst of life because the Speaker of the House said it from the House chamber because the House chaplain wrote it that way. And the fact that she's not willing to take responsibility and help detox and unwind this myth, I think is really troubling.
It is troubling, but it seems like this is the new normal. If you've been following the rapid deconstruction of the federal government and the standoff with the judiciary, this might seem like a lightweight issue. But let me assure you, this is serious. Now more than ever, we need historians and people who will tell us the truth about history. We are lied to daily by an administration which is erasing history right in front of us. This is a literal fact when you consider the removal of articles and web-based material from government websites. Thank God for the Internet Archive, commonly called the Wayback Machine. We need it, and we need people to keep track of and report what has happened and correct falsehoods where they occurred. Here's another reason why this prayer matter is important. The separation of church and state is important. This principle is at the heart of our republic. It says so much about how close we are to losing it when the Speaker of the House of Representatives is enthralled and deceived by a prayer falsely attributed to Thomas Jefferson but calls the actual words of Jefferson a misnomer, when Jefferson says the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment creates a wall of separation between church and state. Just so you don't miss it, here is Johnson reacting to words Jefferson did not write or say.
I wanted to share it with you here at the end of my remarks, not as a prayer per se right now, but as a reminder of what our third president and the primary author of the Declaration of Independence thought was so important that it should be a daily recitation.
Now, here is Johnson reacting to words Jefferson did write.
The separation of church and state is a misnomer. People misunderstand it. Of course, it comes from a phrase that was in a letter that Jefferson wrote. It's not in the Constitution.
See the difference? Johnson holds up the false words as indicative of Jefferson's beliefs, but downplays his real words as a misnomer and minimizes their importance. When Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptists on January 1st, 1802, he said, quote, "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state," end quote. Jefferson told the Baptist ministers of Danbury, Connecticut, that the words of the First Amendment built a wall of separation between church and state. The wall of separation between church and state is not a misnomer. It is a correct and accurate designation for the relationship between religion and government under the Constitution. On the other hand, the prayer that Johnson erroneously attributed to Jefferson is the misnomer. That prayer, delivered by Johnson and attributed to Jefferson, confuses American and Christian identities. Jefferson's actual words separate religion and government. The make-believe words bring them together. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in the backwards and the upside down. It's time to hold on to what is real and strengthen the things that remain. I want to thank Brian Kaylor and Seth Cotlar for joining me today. Music was provided by Roman Candle, Earl's Taco Shack, Jonas Fair, Jonathan Swaim, Robo Surgeon Fish, and Dustin Blatnick. The podcast is written and hosted by yours truly. The next episode should be out within the next 2 weeks. See the show notes for more information and credits. For more information about getting Jefferson right and telling Jefferson lies, go to gettingjeffersonright.com. Please like the podcast and write a lovely review wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps and makes us feel good too. Thanks for listening.